class. My name is Naomi Inglar. I'm the Communications and Training Manager for the Center of Excellence in Maternal and Child Health and the Tulane Prevention Research Center, two of today's sponsors. I want to thank our other sponsors who are helping promote and support this seminar series. The Mary Amelia Women's Center, the Society of Young Black Public Health Professionals, the Tulane African Student Association, Salute for Latin American Communities, and SURF, which is Students United for Reproductive Freedom / Public Health. I want to thank all of you for being here today. This is our third and final seminar in the fall 2018 series for our Health, Racism, and Communication seminar series. Don't fret, we're going to have 3 more in the spring. So please be on the lookout for those promotions next semester. Some housekeeping, if you didn't already, do please sign in outside. It's very important that we note how many people come to these seminars and who you all are, whether you're students, whether you're community partners, whether you're public health professionals. This helps us tell our funders who we're serving with these trainings so that we can continue to provide trainings for you all. Also, do please take an evaluation form. Similarly, this helps us know, are we meeting your needs for trainings? So that is very helpful as well. We are also using a hashtag for these seminars, so please follow or post today. It's Tulane HRC Seminar. And I am going to turn it over to Bechet Turner. She is from the Society of Young Black Public Health Professionals, and she's going to introduce our speaker today.
Good afternoon, everybody. All right, so I have, hello. I have the honor and pleasure of introducing our speaker for today. Troi Bechet has over 30 years of human service experience. She holds a bachelor's degree in psychology from the University of New Orleans and a master's in social work from Southern University at New Orleans. Troi currently serves as the CEO of the Center for Restorative Approaches, otherwise known as the CRA, which she founded in 2008. In this capacity, she has trained over 2,000 educators, youth, and community members in the use of restorative approaches to build relationships and development of consensus-driven solutions for justice and well-being. Prior to founding CRA, Troi served as the director of the Community Building Initiative at Neighborhood Housing Services, where she worked to amplify resident voices and ensure their involvement in rebuilding efforts after Hurricane Katrina. Ms. Bechet has also served as the director of the Arts Council of New Orleans Art Business Center and the vice president of operations at the Private Industry Council of New Orleans. Troi is also a performing artist and arts activist. She was a member of the touring cast of Swimming Upstream, a play about the spirit of New Orleans in the wake of the Katrina levee outbreaks, directed by Kenny Leon, and later Eve Ensler, where she shared the stage with Felicia Rashad, Jasmine Guy, Kerry Washington, along with other local cast members. Swimming Upstream has also marked Troi's debut as a theatrical composer, having written many of the songs for the production. Please help me in welcoming Troi as our third and final speaker in our series.
Good afternoon. How y'all doing? Fantastic. All right. So I always feel really uncomfortable when I hear my bio read. I would have made it more theatrical if I had known she was going to read it. But anyways, you see here, this is our mission at the Center for Restorative Approaches, nurturing our humanity one person, one circle, one community at a time. And as you heard, I founded it in 2008, and that was shortly after Katrina. And we had, at that time, we were in Louisiana, the incarceration capital of the world. We are only slightly better than that now. But what the statistics showed was that there was a systemic racial divide in incarceration. And I'm going to talk more about that later on. But it is one of the reasons that I founded the Center for Restorative Approaches, in addition to really helping people to see each other's humanity as opposed to not seeing that humanity and interact in ways that really nurtured humanity in each other. So restorative approaches, I forgot to turn my timer on. Let me do that because I don't want to go over. All right, so restorative approach is essentially a storytelling process. So I'm going to tell you a story of the impetus for starting the center. So way back in probably 2007, I was in Baltimore, and I heard about restorative approaches, and I asked the director of the Community Conferencing Center in Baltimore that had been doing restorative work for at least a decade. I was in Baltimore. I said, is it possible for me to come and see one of these circles that I've heard about? And she was gracious enough to allow me to come and observe that circle. So we actually sit in a circle. There were 5 girls that had banked another girl. You say, bank, what is that, Troi? I asked that same question. Banked. Jumped. That's what that means in Baltimore. They had jumped another girl, pulled her actual hair out of her head, injured a security guard and a teacher. And a facilitator who happened to have a degree, I found out later on, in marketing, but had learned how to facilitate restorative circles, brought all 6 of those young ladies together, the security guard, a couple of teachers, an administrator, all of the young ladies' guardians together to sit in a big circle. And as I sat on the outskirts of that circle, my eyes were immediately called to a young lady. And she was about, I'm tall, I'm 5'9". She was about 6 feet tall. And she was probably over 200 pounds. And she had this scowl on her face and her fist balled, sitting at the edge of her chair. For almost the entire circle, she looked like she was going to punch everybody in that circle out. And I am thinking, this is not a good situation right here. Maybe I should get closer to the door. But I watched as the facilitator masterfully talked to everybody in that circle. And even when this young lady, and she had a big voice, and I have a big mouth. They asked me earlier, do you need a microphone? Do I need a microphone? No, I do not. I do not. Nor did she. And she would raise her voice and she would yell, and the facilitator just skillfully moved on to the next person and reminded people that they were there in order to come to a consensus about how to move forward in the most positive way. And I watched, feeling on edge, for the majority of the circle. But about halfway after the circle, maybe about 30-something minutes into the circle, a mother spoke. This was at a school for adjudicated youth. And these are children, obviously, who have had lots of problems with behavior, have had interactions with law enforcement. And the young girl, I don't know her exact age, but her mother indicated that she was over age. I'm guessing that she was maybe 17 or 18 years old. And she was a sophomore. So she was behind. And the mother starts to talk about, when they asked her about what happened and, how she was feeling about what happened, she starts to say that she felt so terrible as a mother. She says, my daughter is a sophomore in high school and she's behind. She's not doing well in school. I'm concerned that she might not even graduate. I feel like a horrible mother. And I have been so stressed out by everything that has happened that I had a heart attack. And I watched this young lady who had been sitting on the edge of her chair with her fist balled like she was going to pummel everybody there, lean into this woman, unball her fist, look her in the eye and say, ma'am, I am so sorry. I would never want anything to happen to my mother. And if I did anything to hurt you in any way, I apologize. And I realized that this was something all of us needed. The opportunity to see the human impact, to see the humanity of the people that we touch. And when we hurt them in some way, to be a part of a community that says that we embrace you as a part of this community, but we expect you to be held accountable in a way that if you cause harm, you repair that harm to the extent possible. So I want you to think about Gemma. We're going to call this young lady Gemma, the one with her fist ball. That is not her real name. I have changed the name to protect, like they do at, like, what's that, the NCIS or whatever that is. So what kind of emotions do you think Gemma was feeling at the beginning? Just raise your hand. What kind of emotions do you think she was feeling? Yep. Anger. All right. And after the circle, when they were all able to get, oh, and I didn't tell you this part. At the end of the circle, Gemma called the young lady. She seemed like she was kind of the ringleader of the jumping of the young girl. She called the young lady to come and take a selfie with all of the rest of the girls. So she kind of brought her back into the circle. So after the circle was over, how do you think Gemma was feeling? Raise your hand. More compassionate and understanding. Right. And in the circle, they came to an agreement by consensus of how to repair the harm that was done. So feeling maybe that, she was a decent person, right? That she could be responsible and accountable. And the school lifted her up to be able to do that. So well, let me ask you this. So one of the things that we really try to do is build empathy in people. And this is our definition: a connection to another person that promotes the ability to understand their thoughts and emotions and to respond accordingly. So that was a conflict situation, and we're going to talk more about conflict in a minute. But raise your hand for me if you have ever had a conflict. Everybody's hand should go straight on up. All right. Raise your hand if you have ever experienced a conflict in which somebody had more power than you. Put your hand down. Raise your hand if you have ever experienced a conflict in which you were determined to show somebody that they did not have more power than you. Right. So this work really is about equalizing that power. So if we're trying to get people to show empathy, what is the likelihood that you're going to show empathy if you're trying to show somebody that they don't have more power than you, like Zipper, right? And what kind of empathy do we generally have for people when they levy like strong power over us? Not a whole lot. So this equalizing of power really helps us to help people to have empathy. So in that circle, Gemma was able to have empathy for that mother, something she hadn't had before. Because most of what she said was it was unfair, the other young lady deserved what happened, all of those things. But by the end, she was able to have more empathy and understanding for what was going on. So that's really what we're trying to do. Neuroscientists say that the amygdala is the epicenter of empathy. So we're trying to get people to have big amygdalas, active amygdalas. And we set up situations and structures that allow us to do that. So this is what restorative approaches is, essentially. And you see here that we focus on relationships. Building them, strengthening them, and repairing them when they are harmed. And you see here it can be used in workplaces, in schools, and in the justice system. Essentially, wherever there are people, you can use restorative approaches. Because we want to intentionally start with building relationships. So when most people hear restorative justice, or hear restorative approaches, they think restorative justice. Because restorative justice is where all of this work started within the justice system. But around the 90s, restorative approaches started moving into other arenas. As I said, anywhere where there are people. And rather than just focusing on the reparation of relationships, focusing on primary prevention. How do we build relationships intentionally? How do we strengthen relationships so that when conflict happens, we are more likely to want to resolve that conflict in healthy ways? So the way that we do that in terms of building relationships is that we do a lot of work, we do most of our work in circle, but we bring people together in circle just to do some radical thing. Talk to each other. Just talk to each other and learn more about each other. We are starting actually to do a lot more work in workplaces. And surprise, surprise, in workplaces, people don't always talk to each other in really productive ways. And sometimes when a conflict happens, rather than go talk to the person about it, they do things. We had a referral recently where a simple misunderstanding ended up with a person filing a grievance against somebody else. And later apologized for that and said, I really should have just come to talk to you, but didn't feel that the system supported her in just going to talk to the person. Two, didn't feel she had the skills to do that when she felt uncomfortable about something that was said to her. That ended up being a misunderstanding. So setting up those structures where people actually come together and really talk to each other and intentionally learn how to communicate in healthy ways when conflict happens. So, let's see what's next on the hit parade. All right, so I said earlier that we have this systemic racism really enters the picture when you look at statistics about incarceration all around the world. But up until recently, as I said, Louisiana was the incarceration capital of the world. We now have the distinction of being the second highest incarceration rate in the world, just behind Oklahoma. But when you look at this map, you see the United States, and it's skewed by prison population. So on the left here, you see the United States as 5% of the world's population, so tiny, comparatively. But then you look over here and you see this big swollen United States because we are 25% of the prison population. 25% of the prison population. And despite the fact that we are now number 2, we still see a systemic racial divide that leads to incarceration and significant disproportionality in terms of things that not only about incarceration, but the things that lead to incarceration. So if you are black and male in New Orleans, you have a 1 in 7 chance of being on probation, on parole, or in prison. I'm going to say that again. You have a 1 in 7 chance of being on probation, on parole, or in prison. And what we are seeing is that that path starts at least in school. Some folks say before school, and that is probably correct. But we know definitively that there is a school-to-prison pipeline where you see African American boys are more likely than any other student group to face arrest, suspension, and expulsion in schools. That's across the nation. If you are a young African American male in school, you are more likely to be arrested there, suspended there, or expelled from the school altogether. They are 3 times more likely to receive an out-of-school suspension than their white counterparts. 3 times more likely. And what do you think the rate is for African American girls? Any guesses? Boys are 3 times more likely to receive an out-of-school suspension. It's higher? You are correct. 6 times. 6 times more likely. And it's no, it is no wonder that we are rapidly seeing a growing population of females of color in the prison population. So much of our work is really to stem that as well. How do we hold people accountable in ways that don't lead to this significant disproportionality? Can we do something other than suspend them, arrest them, or expel them? Can we do something other than send young people to prison. So recently we received, well not recently, about a year ago, we received a referral for a case that happened in the French Quarter. Did you guys hear about, raise your hand if you heard about the 2 Unitarians that were jumped by 4 boys from the young men from what's the name of the homeless shelter?
Covenant House.
Covenant House, thank you very much. 4 young men, residents of Covenant House. They did a terrible, terrible thing. A terrible thing. They jumped these 2 young men. One of them ended up hospitalized for several weeks. He was in a concussion for part of that time. But the Unitarian church here locally approached me and said, Troi, would you be willing to do a restorative circle? I said, if you can get the DA to do a restorative circle, I will do it for nothing. For nothing. And we spent a year, or they spent a year, actually. I just was along for the ride. Where they went to court every time these young men had to go to court with T-shirts on. Standing in love, I think they said. The 2 young men who were jumped sent impassioned pleas to the DA, to the judge, saying, we don't want these young men to go to jail. 2 of those young men, 3 of those young men, while they were in prison, had competency hearings. Now, competency is super low. The level of competency is way low. But these young men had challenges that limited their capacity to really think through their actions when they were happening. One of the young men had his jaw broken while he was in jail. They spent almost a year in jail, and the last time they went to court, they took a plea. Now, those young men, for doing that terrible thing, could have gotten 40 years. And when the lawyers talked to the judge said, I'm starting at 30. These are 18 and 19-year-old young men who are residents of Covenant House, have limited capacity, and lots of challenges. They ended up getting the equivalent of 3 years, and the judge said the only reason why is because the 2 victims and the entire Unitarian church here in New Orleans asked for some other kind of justice. Another kind of justice where you bring people together to talk about those things. So, if you saw this happening, we're going to talk about conflict for a minute. If you saw this happening, raise your hand. What would you do or ask if you saw this? What's the first thing you would ask? Why are you doing that? Have you ever asked a child why they did something? Do they ever say, oh, I am so sorry, that was not the right thing to do, I feel so irresponsible? No, they do not say that. Generally they say, why are you always picking on me? You didn't see what she did to me yesterday. All of those things, and what we actually want is for them to take responsibility for their actions. But why questions put people on the defensive. And guess what? It does not change when you get to be an adult. Because one of our brains, our biology is most attuned to protection. That's what we do best. That's why our species has survived all of this time. So we ask different questions to get better responses. Okay. All right. So these are the restorative questions. Rather than ask people why they did something or something else that is going to put them on the defensive, we ask them what happened. And my clock is not showing me the time. All right. We ask them what happened and just let them tell their story. And that is exactly what happened in that circle I talked about with Gemma. They ask everybody, what happened? And they tell from their own perspective. And nobody says, that's not what happened. At least not the facilitator. The facilitator who's bringing those people together does not say, no, that's not what happened. I saw what happened. Because we're just letting them tell their story. Because when you are in fight or flight on defensive, you are not going to get to accountability and responsibility. That's not going to happen. So we allow you to say the story in the way that you need to and begin to calm down. And that's generally what we see. And then we ask people, after they've had a chance to tell their story, who was affected and how were they affected? So you have to think about that. Who was affected by what happened? I generally start with, how were you affected? Because that's the easiest thing to talk about. Well, I did this, that, and the other, and this happened to me. And who else was affected? And then we go on to get them to understand that those actions impacted somebody in some way. And then, how do we make things right? So the person who caused the harm definitively has a lot of responsibility. But this is the thing. Sometimes people don't have the capacity to repair things on their own. And in a community, a real community that really looks out for each other, then we are responsible for helping those people get to making things right. And when we do that, they generally do it. And I'm going to talk about our statistics a little bit later. All right, so this is our definition of conflict. A disagreement in which the parties involved perceive a threat to their needs. What do you notice about that definition? Raise your hand. You got to speak as loud as me, almost.
Perception.
Perception. Doesn't matter if it's real, you just have to perceive a threat. What else do you notice? Needs. Thank you very much. If I was the teacher, you'd get an A. Needs, but we don't often think about needs. Gemma needed something when she was in that circle. She wasn't getting it. I don't know for sure, but my guess was she needed to feel like people thought that she was a decent human being. That she wouldn't do something to somebody unless it was justified, right? That she was a leader. So when we figure out what people need, we can help to resolve the conflict. And so that is the focus, to listen for needs. So when we're asking these restorative questions, we are actually listening. Because if you listen to the questions and just be quiet, not talk, you will begin to understand what the needs are. Now, nobody's going to say, I need autonomy, generally not. They're not going to say that, but you will probably hear that. You will probably hear that and begin to figure out ways together. How do you get that in a way that also meets my needs? So in this workplace conflict, the person said something that was misinterpreted, and the person felt uncomfortable. She felt like she felt threatened, actually. The person who made that statement was Latina and has a different way of communicating. So for her, it meant one thing from her culture. And to this Caucasian female, it meant something different. So rather than say, my need for security, my need for peace, in your mind is being threatened in this moment, maybe I should just check and make sure that there is an actual threat. She acted on the threat. But taking the time to listen, hey, I'm feeling a little comfortable. Can we just talk about what happened together? I want to tell you how I've been impacted. Is that what you meant by that? And maybe that's enough to resolve the conflict in 60 seconds. But generally, we don't do that. All right, so let's get back to this our social discipline window. So I want you to think. Actually, I want you to think about the worst boss you have ever had. The worst boss you have ever had. Be very careful if your boss is in this room. All right. The worst boss that you have ever had, the boss from hell. And raise your hand. Give me a characteristic of that boss. Loud. Okay, well, I'm loud. No, just kidding. What else? What else?
Controlling.
Controlling, yes.
Bullying.
to make you hurry up and do something.
Oh, okay. So not cognizant of your needs. Their need for expediency takes precedence over your personal needs, or some bullying. Right. So we call that doing things to people. We are high in control, boundary, structure, high in accountability, but very low in support and care. So whose needs are being met when you're rushing people, bullying them, trying to control them? Whose needs are being met? The boss, right? The employee's needs are not necessarily being met. So we call that doing things to people and being punitive. So passive is easy. That's not doing nothing. All kinds of stuff are going. Expectations aren't being met at the job, and that boss does absolutely nothing. Not a great boss either. Or the permissive boss, who is, we call that the oh poor baby boss. Oh poor baby. So there's some person who's not meeting expectations and everybody else is pulling that person's weight. But then we have the restorative boss, doing things with people. And if you don't remember anything else from what I'm saying today, remember this. Being restorative is doing things with. Being restorative is doing things with. So we are high in accountability, but we are also high in support and care. Hence the how can we make things better? How can we make things better? Is implied. There's a whole bunch of questions that you ask the same question. I tell my staff, and you can ask it in a gazillion different ways. You're asking the same question, but you're asking in many, many ways so that you can get to the answers. So doing things with. You are high in accountability, and you are also high in support and care. Relationships matter. So how do you hold people accountable and still maintain a positive relationship with them? If you are in authority. And sometimes if you're not in authority of them, maybe you just have an authority over yourself, and I want to make sure that you're not doing things to show that you have more power over me. But I'm still going to try and do that in a restorative way and do that with you by having a conversation about it and having that conversation in a specific way. So being restorative requires a paradigm shift, a shift in mindset. In our retributive justice system or adversarial justice, that is which one of those windows do you think it is that we just saw? Which window? The adversarial, which one? 2. That's the punitive window. And the restorative justice, collaborative, obviously, that's the with window. We see here that in retributive justice, in the adversarial way, in the doing things to people, we look at what rule or law was violated. You broke this rule. This unwritten rule at work. You're not supposed to say things like that. That rule was violated, and I'm going to file a grievance about that. In restorative justice, in the collaborative way, we look at people and relationships are violated, right? I personally felt violated in some way. I need to talk to you about that. Maybe I just misunderstood what was going on. In retributive justice, justice is directed at the offender, and the victim just testifies. They don't have a whole lot of control over the situation at all. Because when you go to court, who decides what happened? Who decides? The judge or the jury. And the victims might not necessarily be satisfied with what happens. They don't get a say at all in what happens. In restorative justice, the offender, the victim, the community all have decision-making roles. What does that do for a community when people are making decisions together? It really strengthens that community. In retributive justice, we focus on guilt. That is the role. Find out who's guilty and punish them for it. And in restorative justice, again, we focus on needs. What do you need to make things better? What do you need? And whose obligation is it to fulfill that need in the best way possible? And then here, accountability, as I said, equals punishment. But accountability in restorative justice is understanding the impact, taking ownership of responsibility for whatever impact you've caused, and then repairing the harm. So you see the significant shift in the way that we do things. So I said earlier, I talk about results. How close am I? Ooh, all right. So we have done probably a little more than 743. That's what we did last year. 743 circles since 2008 when we were founded. We made 712 agreements. That's 96%. 96% of the time, the people who are in that circle, those community members, decide together what they need in order to make things right. 96% of the time. And 89% of those agreements are compliant. That's pretty darn high. I'm very proud of that. But these are the same statistics we see around the world. So it's not unique to the Center for Restorative Approaches. It is unique to restorative approaches. Because we bring people together, we allow them to tell their stories, we scaffold them up to responsibility, and then together they work on whatever those agreements are. All right, and I am done. Any questions?
So Nadi, you want to come up and help facilitate the discussion? Nadi is from the Tulane African Student Association. Okay.
Hi, my name is Lisa. I'm going to help Nadi and also I'll do the Q&A section because she has to leave and go to work soon.
Yes.
Thank you. I have just a couple of questions. One would be, how do you get this to work differently? You have one person that's wanting to do the restorative acts and the other person not. And how do you relate this to underlying racism workshops that
we do?
I've done a underlying racism workshop.
Yeah.
But there are going to be people, I don't know if you can actually train people, teach people to feel empathy. Some people just do. And some people are like, I don't care what y'all do. I'm not having pity for you. So how do you get a person to develop that empathy? And how do you get them all on the same page?
Yeah, great questions. There were several in there. I will do my best to remember them. First, let me say that we also do anti-racism work explicitly. A series, a 16-hour dialogue process that can be broken up into 4 4-hour sessions, or I really like the 2.5-hour sessions where people can actually have time to think about all of those things, and we go over the entire history of where racism started, how it's been institutionalized since John Punch. How many of you heard of John Punch? Very good. Yeah, John Punch. Some historians say that John Punch was the first case of affirmative action in the United States. John Punch was an African American, well, he was an African. He was an indentured servant. He escaped with a Dutchman and a Scotsman. And they caught them all. And the Dutchman and the Scotsman, who were obviously European American, got some years added to their servitude. John Punch got life. Life. So what the historians say is that it is affirmative action for white people. And our history has demonstrated affirmative action through our laws and practices since then, including redlining and lots of other laws and practices that have given preference to given preference to people who are not. Let me say that. So the two that we talk about. Two, These processes are voluntary, 100% voluntary. So sometimes people opt out. About 29% of the referrals that we get, people opt out or we can't schedule it or something like that. So that helps when the process is voluntary. The process is voluntary. It allows you not to feel like somebody is doing something to you, right? So that helps to put you in an empathy mindset. 2, people are not judged in circles. We allow things to happen so that even a person like Gemma, who is upset, thinking she's right about what she did, thinking the whole world is against her, the system is unfair. The humanity in her comes out and she sees that love. So that when you didn't think you'd see empathy, because I didn't think I was going to see empathy at all. I'm telling you, I was trying to figure out how to get past it from the but the empathy comes. The empathy comes. And the more we put people in those situations, the more we build that empathy muscle. Did that answer your question? Yes.
Some people say that
I mean, some people don't, but those people, but that's rare. You know, the people who never feel empathy are stupid. That's not how we define it. We don't have that many. Despite what we think it feels sometimes, there are not that many sociopaths in the world compared to the rest of the population. Most of us feel some empathy for somebody. We have to extend that empathy to other people that we connect with. We don't feel empathy for people who are connected to us. So the role of the facilitator is to make that connection. Yep.
Yeah, I was seeing how you see this playing out in cases of drug laws. I could see this being potentially problematic to have like an addict on trial or something. How do you do restorative justice when it's drugs or addiction? Yeah.
Why do you think it would be?
I could see it being problematic if you have a circle with an addict, someone who has a disease, and you're talking about how they hurt people, how you, when it's just drug laws involved.
What do you know about the 12-step program? Okay, so you got to accept responsibility for the things you've done, right? That's one of the steps.
Yeah, I guess I have some problems with
So unless the person is mentally incapacitated by the drugs at the moment, you can do the circle. We err on the only time we don't do a circle is if we think there's going to be additional harm. So in cases of, say, domestic violence or something like that, where there's a significant power imbalance, if the person is not accepting responsibility for their behavior, or we feel that they're going to use that power in some way in the circle, we won't do the circle, or bullying in schools or something like that, unless we feel that the person will accept some responsibility and want to repair the harm in whatever way possible. Those are the only real instances where, or the primary instances where we won't do a circle, or the person just doesn't want to do it. Yeah. I don't know that you still look quizzical, so I'm not sure that I answered your question.
No, I think we might have different views on it.
Okay. So what do you think is the roadblock to doing it? Let's give you a specific roadblock.
I have difficulty accepting that we should be having addicts taking that sort of responsibility. I guess I have some problems with the 12-step.
Oh, yeah. I can see how that would make it difficult for you to understand.
Yeah.
But restorative approaches really is about accepting responsibility for the community that you're in. But the difference is responsibility with arms wrapped around you. Not blame responsibility, not bad person responsibility. Separating the deed from the doer. We all have that I would bet $1 to a donut, like my grandmother used to say, that not a person in this room has never made a mistake. All of us have made a mistake, but we are not our worst mistake. No matter what that mistake is, that is not the totality of us. And so this process says that is one thing. but you have all of this other privilege. And those things can help you to repair the harm done. And when you do that, it makes you a stronger member of this community, and it makes our community stronger. And we are going to help you. That's the difference.
You have a question on the second row here? Yeah.
Which one? Yes.
So the examples that you use were kind of with adolescents or young adults. Is that something that like an age group might be more effective, or is it really more?
It is anybody who can talk and understand you. So we've done it with kids as young as 5, and we've had people in certain who were interviews. Yep. Hey.
How many schools do you work with in New Orleans?
Not enough.
In addition to the first part of the question,
Yeah.
with the schools that you work with now currently, how are you perceived as it relates to restorative approaches and conflict resolution? How are you received as it relates to the parents, the administration? How are you received with that? Because I have a personal experience. That's why I'm asking.
Okay. I'm not exactly. I mean, we're received. This is a voluntary process, so no school is forced to do this. They generally come to us and ask us to do it. But this is the thing. We're asking people to change a mindset and behavior. So I talked about the fact that we are primed biologically to protect ourselves. Fight or flight the moment we perceive threats. And when you are in a situation in which a child has done something that they could be suspended for, and that's pretty broad, when a child you can be suspended for what I call being an adolescent. Because if you expect an adolescent not to challenge authority ever, there's something wrong with you. You're not living in reality. That's what adolescents do. So how do we channel that in ways that allows them to meet behavior expectations, but still learn to grow up? And you know what? There's some things happening in the world right now that we need to be challenging authority. So I don't want us to not just be complacent about things. When that happens, the adult goes into fight or flight. And despite the fact that they will say, Troi, we so believe in restorative approaches, we think it's wonderful, you are so right, we have to stop suspending these children. As soon as something happens, guess what happens? They're like, you need to be suspended. And let me tell you how I understand this. I was teaching a class right after I learned about restorative approaches. And you heard that I'm a performing artist, so I was teaching essentially a drama class. And a kid was twirling a stick in class. Now, I have what I call a high tolerance for creative behavior. I have very high tolerance for that. But that was dangerous, right? So I said, oh, sweetie, twirling that stick, you could hurt somebody. Put the stick down. My bad, Miss Troi, my bad. Now, 5 minutes later, I'm like, ooh, Miss Troi was not clear. You pick up that stick again, I'm going to have to take that stick. That's dangerous, okay, sweetie? My bad, Miss Troi, my bad. Now, 5 minutes later, give me the stick. No. Did this child just disrespect me in front of the entire class? That is what I immediately thought. I said, oh, you didn't hear me. Give me the stick. No. 2 times. And before I could think about it, I said, get out of my class. And it took me all of 20 seconds to say that was the least restorative thing you could do. But my fight or flight had kicked in. And so I got the kids to work on, they were working on a project, and I got them to do the work, and I said, Miss Troy's going out in the hallway, and I stopped the young man before he went to the office. Because this was a kid who was biting his nails. He was a senior, but not doing well. He was doing well in my class, but not in any other class. And I bet $1 to a donut, like my grandmother would say, that child would have been suspended if he had gotten it, because he had some problems in the class. and he might not graduate. So as quickly as my fight or flight kicked in that quickly, because really I had a restorative mindset, I said, that is hypocritical. We need to go do something different. And then I asked him the restorative questions, and this is what I learned. The stick had been given to him by a friend who was murdered. Recently. He burst like, this is what I heard through sobs. Like he was sobbing so hard I could barely understand what he was saying. So it was not a defense mechanism, a coping mechanism. You know, and he's like, I didn't mean to disrespect you, Ms. Troi, blah, 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 blah. So I say that to say, people can have the best intentions, but just like we expect young people to do things different and meet behavior expectations and change their behavior over time, we have to have the same expectations for adults. They will not change a behavior that they've had for 30 years, 40 years, 50 years, 60 years, and some instances overnight. So we also have to be there to help them. To say, remember when you talk about restorative, you know, what if you restorative, this is a perfect opportunity for you to do that. I know it's hard, but remember the goal is to end the disproportionality of these children. Did that answer your question? My very long-winded answer. Yes.
In the back row, you have a question? Yeah. Yeah. The way back. Yeah.
I really caught on the word needs in your definition of conflict.
Yep.
And I'm wondering that given the historical lack of access, boundaries, barriers that people of color experience to having their needs met, right? When you have these restorative circles, are there times when you discover that the need that the person has, right, is being blocked by something structural, institutional, that you actually don't have any power over fixing? And then how does the community come together to fix something that they don't have any power over?
So, that's a complicated question. I'm going to give you a complicated answer. The role of the facilitator is to put the people in the circle who can solve the problem. Right? So when we go into schools, we say we need to have an administrator who has decision-making ability in that circle. Principal, if that is you, then you're going to have to be in the circle. If not, you're going to have to delegate that responsibility to somebody else. They need to be able to decide. And we have seen some structural modifications made for kids, particularly around like special education issues and or the family needs some support at home or whatever those situations are. Because the facilitator is neutral, you don't get to come up with any of the answers. You have to put the people in the circle that have the answers. And I will tell you, I've been amazed at the creative ability of people to come together to solve a problem when you give them the ability to do that. So we prep everybody in the circle before the circle happens. Everybody. That can take hours. That is one reason why schools don't like it. I lost my lady. Because it takes a long time, but that's why the success rates are so high. Right? We know all of the issues from all of the different perspectives, and we are finding people to come into that circle to fix those problems. We're pretty good at it. we're pretty good at it. I haven't really encountered any significant structural problems that we've not been able to put some decision maker in that can make the modifications if they choose to.
As a theater artist, public health worker,
Yes, ma'am.
Oh, yes.
Hi.
Hey.
Thank you so much for an excellent presentation. My question, and I apologize, I missed the first few minutes, but it seems like restorative justice is used to address a problem of conflict. But are there techniques that can be used to build community through restorative justice principles prior to a conflict so that the system is already in place
Yeah.
to address conflict.
Yeah. You missed it.
Oh, I did. Okay.
That's okay. I didn't talk a lot about it because the part that is generally of most interest to people is just fixing the problem. But really just bringing people together to talk. So we train people on how to do what we call community building circles. And it doesn't matter what community you're in. It could be any community. The role is, like schools, workplaces, you just bring people together in a circle to talk. And that builds the connections that are needed in order to have you want to resolve conflicts when they occur. Because guess what? Conflicts always occur. Every day there is a conflict. And how you choose to resolve that conflict is up to you. The other piece is intentionally teaching conflict resolution skills. We don't do that. We don't teach people conflict resolution skills and expect them to be able to resolve conflict in healthy ways. So helping them to learn how to do that intentionally is also one of the tools that we use. And those really primarily, and having an environment in which you can give and receive feedback to each other. That is one of the measures that we use. Is this organization, is this community restorative? If you can give and receive feedback to each other with grace, you'll probably restore it. Yeah?
Any other questions?
What is the demographic like as far as where you've done these circles? I know we've talked about it being done in New Orleans, but you also talked about it being done in some workplaces in different states. So can you tell us, like, kind of what the different states were? Was it like in the South, North?
You mean for us, for CRA? Well, we're a tiny, tiny organization, so we don't do a lot of work outside of the greater New Orleans area. Atlanta is the furthest that we've extended this work into. But restorative approaches is done all over the world with virtually every kind, not virtually, with every kind of community that there is. People have done restorative.
And what's the race demographic like as far as the people involved in these circles?
And for us in New Orleans, they're predominantly African. Well, people of color. We have Hondurans and Vietnamese, and the demographic of New Orleans. Public schools, and in workplaces that tends to shift to maybe 50-50 people of color and other people. I'm sorry.
Do you work with police officers also? Do you work with police officers also?
We did we produced a play. Actually, inspired by the life of my mother-in-law, who was one of the first African-American females on the police force, and helped to found, I'm telling my age now, but the Officer Friendly program way back in the day, where police officers go to school, let kids know that police officers are the people that you come to when you have problems, and most children don't believe that anymore, particularly children of color. And work in community relations, really building relations between the police and the community, which is essentially gone. There's no money for that anymore. So the idea behind the play, again, arts activist, right, is using that play to help people have dialogues with the police. And we're hoping to extend that work more into the police department to allow community members and police to be able to work together better, to communicate better, and have community safety as a mutual that they would.
You have a question on the back row over there?
Yeah.
Yes.
So I'm like kind of similar to what you said earlier. I have some reservations about this 12-step program just because of the importance that's placed on personal responsibility and accountability and not structural and community responsibility and accountability. And I was wondering, I used to teach for a short amount of time, and like a lot of my students who were in special education, like reasons why they were expelled or suspended had very little to do with personal choice and willpower, and a lot to do with what structures were not in place. I knew so-and-so was going to have a really bad day if said teacher actually had to be
use a different classroom because there was no substitute. Because we would often use our sped teachers and their substitute. So my question is there a space in your restorative circles for there to be a more shared responsibility and for the individual who maybe is perceived as the one who committed this act? Is there space for them to realize, like, what am I not getting and what am I not receiving that maybe is contributing to my actions?
That's a great question. The answer is yes. So there is a shared responsibility, hence how we make it, right? And one of the questions that we always ask is what kind of support can we provide to ensure that these things are done. People talk a lot, parents will talk a lot about structural issues that are causing the problems with the young children. And that's why I said putting a person in a circle that can deal with those structural issues is key to solving the issue or repairing the harm in this particular situation. So it is definitively about accepting responsibility, but responsibility lies on everyone, right? Lies particularly in those structural systemic kinds of issues. Oh, I'm following my leader.
Yeah, right.
Okay.
Say that sort of circle, and you have a fight with yes, jump the girl,
Mm-hmm.
and you had the girls in the room which you jumping.
Yep.
So, what do the victims get out of the whole situation? It's like the girl who was mad the whole time. I have no idea. But what do we do about the victims, like with their own attention or some same issues that with the whole situation? How they help?
So the last question, how do we make things better? We're asking that person, what do you need? What do you need in order to make things better? And sometimes as outsiders looking in, we think that that is like glorified thing, like they need these huge things to make things better. But often they don't. They want to be a part. So I said at the end of the circle, the Gemma asked her to come in and take a picture. Big smile on that young lady's face. Because, being an adolescent girl, we want to be a part. We don't want to be outside, So each person decides what they need. And it's the facilitator's job to make sure that what they're asking for is doable. Can you do this? Do you think it's fair? Do you need any supports to do it? And then some people say, no, it's not fair. The first circle that I ever did, a kid stole 2 6-packs of Gatorade from Walmart. He had one Walmart bag, he put 1 6-pack of Gatorade in it, and he just put the other one under his one. Tried to walk out. And long story short, when we get to the agreement part, the head of security had worked out with their their development department that he could volunteer at a fundraiser they ran. I said, how many hours would you need to volunteer at the fundraiser? And I think the guy said something like 20. And the kid said, 20 hours? That's too many hours. That's not fair, blah, 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 blah. And I said, okay, so what would be fair? 5. And his mama turned to me and looked at him. I spent 5 hours just dealing with this stuff. This baby came to our house. I had to miss my job. You're going to do whatever those people say. And I turned to the security guard and I said, does 5 seem fair? How about 10? And so they went back and forth. And one of the reasons why the compliance is so high is because you get to say, right? So the victim in this case was the store. The store gets to decide what's fair. And if it's not fair, they will say it. They will say that is unacceptable to me. And then we just go back and forth until we find something that is acceptable for everyone.
We have one more question back here.
Yes.
I wanted to ask a little more about the definition of conflict.
Yep.
A disagreement in which the parties involved receive a violation.
Yes.
It seems like sometimes people take dramatic action when there's a perceived threat to their wants. And I'm wondering, are those like things that are too petty to come to your attention, or do you, is that part of the conversation of, especially when you're in the system, like, some people want not to share power.
Yeah.
So, and then there's a threat to that, they want to respond to that, so.
Correct.
Yeah, just, that part of the work is kind of.
So, the part of the work is helping people with their needs. You know, whatever they are, in a way that is agreeable to everybody. So maybe that is an issue, that they don't want to share their power at all. And people start talking about, you know, their need to have autonomy. And so how can we have autonomy and still have you have your need for power, right? So the difference is that you talk about wants and needs, and we really are focused on the needs. We're helping people to see that there are multiple ways to get your needs met. And we talk about those multiple ways until we find some way that they are met. I know we had this lady up here.
You've answered it already.
Okay.
Someone else.
All right. Okay.
Can I ask another one? So you talk about how the sitting in the circle is not equalizing power, and that enables people to connect like empathetically with other people. I can imagine there would be some power dynamics that are like really difficult to strip down and to equalize, like parent and child, like authority figure, principal and child, or whatever. And how is that a lot of work that you do before people sit down in the circle? And okay.
Yeah, we think about that. You know, like how many adults can I put in this circle with this 5-year-old child? You know, how many people would need to be in a workplace conflict where 10 people are having a problem with this one person? You know, how do we deal with that? You know, what questions? I mean, we essentially ask the same questions, but sometimes what we do is what we call a hybrid circle, where we spend a lot of time building community. And really, that's the ancient way. The ancient way says you spend half of the time on building relationships and the other half on fixing money. And there is genius in that, particularly when it's a very complicated situation like you're trying to equalize these power dynamics. Is that we intentionally spend time having the people to get to know each other, talk about how things were before there was a conflict, things like that, so we can try and build that connection between each other before we start talking about it.
And then they re-enter those power dynamics kind of by necessity within the circle, I'm sure a lot of the time.
Right, but if the power dynamics were part of the problem, then we're talking about how to address it. So I've had bosses say, employees say, every time I go to talk to you, you don't let me get a word in. Like, and you raise your voice when you talk to me. That makes me feel really uncomfortable, you know, and we'll put in an agreement that the person gets to talk for 2 minutes before you say anything, or 60 seconds, or whatever it is that they can agree to. And then we check that to see that they're agreed.
Is that any questions?
Okay.